because we need a national.
In horror, the suffering of their most vulnerable and frail loved ones in long-term care. What if tomorrow you had to place a family member in a long-term care facility? Would you do it? Beginning with you, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Blanchet, you may jump in.
Tomorrow is my mom's 73rd birthday, so that is certainly something we're reflecting on, but she's doing wonderfully right now. We won't have to make that decision right now. Don't worry, Mom. The reality is we've heard from seniors across this country who've been tremendously worried through this pandemic, and family members worried about that. We know that the conditions of work for the people who are in those long-term care homes are often dictating the conditions of care for seniors, which is why we propose to hire 50,000 new personal support workers, working with the provinces with the money for that. Also increasing the minimum salary to $25 an hour for people who care for our elders and most vulnerable. Because
so if you had to put mom in long-term care, you would do it?
I would make sure that, yes, that they are people who are properly well cared and that there is enough of a proportionate. And that's where we will work with the provinces to deliver exactly that, because we put real money forward.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. O'Toole.
This we need partnerships for long-term care for the CHSLD in Quebec. We're going to have a $3 billion fund that the provinces can draw on for infrastructure upgrades to long-term care. That's in addition to our record, almost $60 billion commitment over 10 years to the public healthcare system. Universal access with no conditions. We need to partner with the provinces, not create fights. And long-term care, learning from the gaps in the first part of this pandemic is something we need. And I have to address...
Would you put a loved one in long-term care
Absolutely.
tomorrow,
I have a grandmother in one, and we've been in touch with her. But I have to touch on what Mr. Trudeau said about the recovery. We have to get through the pandemic first. Why did you not have that approach to the election, Mr. Trudeau? We're in the fourth wave. Everything in the recovery relates to getting out of the pandemic first. Why didn't we work
Mr. Blanchet, I'm going to let Mr. Blanchet in.
You have had 4 minutes more than I did. So now I think it's enough. The debate is almost over. Some dads and some moms don't have to worry. They will have the money, of course. Some do. And in order to give them the care they need, the care they deserve, those responsible for those cares, provinces and Quebec, should have, without conditions, because it is their responsibility, their knowledge, their expertise, the resources required. When the Army came in Quebec, they wrote a report afterward. What did they say? They did not say Quebec is not good enough to take care of its seniors. They said they lacked resources. They lacked the money.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Leaders, we are starting to get out. We're running out of time. I am sorry. Mr. Trudeau, you've had the most time tonight. I'm sorry, Mr. Trudeau. We are now moving on to our final journalist of the night. I am welcoming Evan Solomon from CTV News. He's going to be putting questions to you on COVID recovery, starting with Mr. Singh. Hey, Evan.
Hi, Shachi, and hi, leaders. Good to see all of you. Mr. Singh, I'll start with you, sir. Your pandemic recovery plan is uncosted. You have no plan to balance the books, but you promise to pay for your expensive promises, new programs like universal dental care with taxing the super rich and taxing corporations. What specifically would you do to create the 1 million jobs you're promising and make sure Canada stays competitive?
We have the only credible plan that's not going to cut help to Canadians, that's not going to put the burden back on the same people that have struggled. We're the only ones on this debate table that can say clearly we would tax the billionaires. We would make sure companies like Amazon start paying their fair share so we can invest in those new jobs, so we can invest in people. Left to Mr. Trudeau or Mr. O'Toole, they are going to put the burden back on you. They've already started. Mr. Trudeau has already started by cutting the CRE. Cutting help to people.
But what new programs, sir, specifically?
Well, I believe in making sure we invest in pharmacare, we invest in dental care, we invest in retrofitting homes and buildings. In doing this, we're going to lower the cost of living, help people save money, but also create jobs by investing in the future economy, the economy of the future.
All right. Mr. Trudeau, to you. Only 4 months ago, you released a budget that was billed as a pandemic recovery program, a plan that had $101 billion of new spending. Since then, COVID numbers are up, growth numbers are down. Now you got a new plan that adds $78 billion of new spending, essentially rendering your last budget out of date. How do Canadians trust that these new massive spending promises will not just keep growing in another few months? And what do you say to the next generation who say, how are we going to pay for this?
Well, first of all, I made a promise during this pandemic to have people's backs. Every time I came out of my house early on in the pandemic to talk directly to Canadians, I told them I'd be there for you. And that's exactly what we've done. And it wasn't just being there for people because we're nice, although of course we are. It was being there because that is the best way to ensure a strong recovery. Now, yes, our budget showed our ambition for this country, including with $10 a day childcare that Mr. O'Toole is planning on ripping up, but we also shows a responsible fiscal track. And even with our fully costed platform that is even more ambitious on the fight against climate change, on housing, on supports for people, the debt of our country as proportion of the GDP continues to decrease.
Yes or no? Is it important to have a plan to balance the budget because you don't have one? Yes or no?
It is important to stay fiscally responsible, and that's what we're doing. Our debt continues to decrease as a share of our GDP.
We got to move on.
Ms. Paul, to you now. You have not been clear if you support the need for vaccine passports or mandatory vaccines for federal workers or even mandatory vaccines for your own candidates. Given that the fourth wave is really a pandemic of the unvaccinated and threatening to overwhelm many healthcare systems, how do you justify not supporting the very measures that have proven to be most effective at increasing vaccination rates?
Evan, we just filmed a video today asking everyone to get vaccinated. We have been unequivocal in our support for vaccinations.
Mandatory vaccinations and vaccine passports.
Well, again, this is just this is again where policy gets put aside for partisan advantage, because everyone on this stage understands that everyone who can be vaccinated should be vaccinated. We need to encourage people to do it. Vaccine saves lives. And every single person on the stage has also said that, of course, there are going to be people who are not able to get vaccinated for certain reasons, and we have to reasonably accommodate them. We will always be guided by the science. We will never put partisan concerns ahead of public health.
Mr. O'Toole, you promise a $60 billion increase in healthcare transfers over the next 10 years, but according to the Independent Parliamentary Budget Officer, it's actually only a transfer of $3.6 billion for the next 5 years, which is not much different than the status quo. But you also support private-public synergies, in your words. Can you specify here tonight exactly what kinds of private healthcare innovations you want to see more of? And if a province introduces more private health care, would you enforce the Canada Health Act by holding back any of your promised funding?
I 100% support our public and universal system. I've said it's paramount. And after COVID-19, we need to rebuild it. So we have the most substantive plan to do that. 6% increase per year, stable, predictable, without conditions funding to partner with our provinces. We will respect them running and putting priorities to get wait times down, to give more choice, for universal public access. That's what we need. On top of that, Evan, we have a substantial commitment in mental health and treatment for addiction. There are going to be lingering aspects from this pandemic that we're going to do in addition.
But just,
the provinces are in charge of their system. We will respect that. Public and universal elements need to be at the core of our system, and our investments will save it and give relief to front lines like our nurses, physicians. Mr. Trudeau doesn't hire those people.
Just for time.
All right, we got to wrap you, Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. Blanchet, Quebecers relied on the federal government for life-saving vaccines and key programs like the CERB. And as you mentioned, the Canadian Armed Forces came in to save people in long-term care homes in the province of Quebec. Some believe this crisis has enforced the argument for a strong federation and undermines your fundamental argument of separatism. Given that, if the federal government, say, gives $1 billion for long-term care homes, which Quebec failed to protect, why should they not also enforce national standards?
I have still not heard from all those brilliant people all over the place and all over Canada what a Canadian can do that a Quebecer cannot do. In what way whatsoever would a Canadian norm be any better than a Quebec norm? I don't see that. And I'm not, I don't have this complex. I don't feel that I'm any a lesser person than a Canadian
I'm
because
asking
I'm a
about enforcing
Quebecer.
national standard. If you pay for something, should you be able to enforce it?
National norms or standards. And I would say that the Premier Legault of Quebec today said, no one is to be entirely trusted in this group of people. Some are worse than others. I think they recognize themselves. But even those who are a little bit less terrible need a watchdog because they're not entitled to a majority government. So if Quebecers want, I will lead the watchdogs.
Okay, this is the open debate section. And I'll start with you, Mr. O'Toole, but everyone please jump in, not all at once. The pandemic recovery is about the future path of Canada. And all of the leaders here tonight have made promises that require historic levels of spending. But as you all know, politics is about hard choices. With some Canadians still in real need of support and other industries experiencing real labor shortages, what specific programs will stay and what will go in the next year, and who will pay for all of this? Mr. O'Toole.
That's a great question, Evan, because we didn't see the government adapt to the changing crisis. What we supported, and we all worked together, the wage subsidy, the CERB, needed to be adapted as there were labor shortages in Quebec, as we can't find enough people for restaurants and service industries. We need to target the highly impacted sectors. That's what our plan, Canada's Recovery Plan, does. We get those service, tourism, restaurants back on their feet, get people working, and with keeping cases low, we can then wind down the other programs because we need to focus on work. We have a job boost that will actually incentivize the hiring of people that have been out of work for 10 months or more.
Mr. O'Toole, let Mr. Singh in.
Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau are jumping over each other about who's going to cut help to people first. I don't agree with that approach. I don't think it makes sense to say, oh, I'm going to have people's back, but I'm going to cut as quickly as I can. I'm going to cut the help to people who need it as much as they can. We're the only party right here clearly is going to say to you, you're not going to have to pay more. We're not going to cut any programs. We're going to ask the 44.
We're giving working Canadians.
Hold on a second. We're going to ask the 44 richest billionaires pay their fair share for
I
once.
think
That's what we're going to do.
respond to that because this is the second time that Mr. Singh has said we're the only party. We're just us. Mr. Singh, you know that's.
Hold on, Mr. Singh.
No, unless you're trying to ghost me, you know that we also okay.
Sure,
so
the Greens
yes,
as well. That's
okay.
Thank
you. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Trudeau, you're trying to get in.
Mr. Singh continues to pretend that it makes no difference whether there is a progressive government or a conservative, or progressive government or a conservative government. We know that it makes a huge difference to families, whether they have $10 a day childcare, whether they have a government that has their back, a government that has a plan to move beyond the Harper targets on fighting climate change. Now, Mr. Singh may feel that for the NDP, it makes no difference who forms government. I know for Canadian families, it makes a
Mr. Blanchet, you haven't been in yet. Mr. Blanchet.
Translate subvention salariale.
Wage subsidy.
Wage subsidy. Did any of you three guys refund the wage subsidy that you received up to about $3 million? That would be something, at least for the principal. After that, there's an important issue, labor shortage. They are promising jobs. They should be promising workers.
Yes.
We need people to work. And that raises the question of productivity. This is the most important issue, and some programs should be turned toward that issue.
Mr. O'Toole.
In this pandemic election that Mr. Trudeau called, after everyone asked him not to, he says he doesn't worry about monetary policy and inflation. Now he's saying he doesn't ever intend to balance the budget. He's spending $424 million a day more than Canada's bringing in.
The question was, what programs will stay?
We need to wind down the support programs in a fair way and get the country working again.
We have got to remember.
Thank you. Last minute of play, leaders. Last minute of play. Ms. Paul, 5 seconds to you. I'm coming to you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you. We have got to remember the pandemic is not over, and all over this country, people still need the benefits. They should be there until the pandemic is over. And to the people of Canada, it is unfortunate we are in this election. You can see that there is a lot of work left to do. We need to get back to doing it in a more cooperative way.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh, I see you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Singh.
One of the specific programs, we demanded 22 times in Parliament for Mr. Trudeau to expand was paid sick leave. Because in this pandemic, people had to make the impossible choice going into work sick or not being able to because they couldn't pay their bills. 22 times over 18 months, we demanded an expansion, and Mr. Trudeau said no to you, and said no to your family.
Last word to you on
Actually
this, Mr.
expanding
Trudeau.
sick leave to 10 days of paid sick leave for federal
the
industries.
election,
Now,
after
in the election, and this is
22 times
important,
of asking for
you
it.
have seen tonight the extreme differences between the perspectives of
Okay,
these parties.
leaders.
We need Canadians to make the right choice
Leaders,
so we
that
can
is
move
it.
forward together.
We're out of time. Evan, thank you. Leaders, thank you for your participation tonight. That's it for the English Language Leaders Debate. Voting day is September 20th. Get your ballots. Make sure you're registered. On behalf of the Leaders Debate Consortium, I want to thank the crew, the producers, everyone who made this happen. I'm Shachi Curl. Good night.
Good night, very much. Good night. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome back to our election 2021 AP10 National News Debate Night Special. And we're going to be breaking down some of what the leaders debate, what you just saw there, including reaction from Gatineau and from social media. And we also welcome back our guests as well. Joining us tonight in studio is Will Godon. Will's the Minister of Housing and Property Management for the Manitoba Métis Federation. And joining us from Edmonton, Jody Callahoo-Stonehouse, who's a former band counselor, educator, and most recently ran for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Let's just get some initial thoughts here. Jody, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on what we just saw? Any highlights or lowlights?
Absolutely. Seeing Melissa on there was just incredible. She did an outstanding job. It was amazing to see her be so clear, precise, and she made us all very proud. What's appalling and embarrassing is the way those leaders conduct themselves. Those are the people who are supposed to run Canada. Their responses were generalized. There was no clear outcomes, strategies. It was very disheartening and unsettling.
Will, your thoughts initially here on what we saw?
Well, I have to say again exactly what Jody said about Melissa. Just a fantastic job, and want to congratulate her on that. But it was a bit of a gong show. Like, I'm trying to watch it, and it's hard to really hear a lot of it. And we were just talking about this earlier, how I don't know if I'd want that job to try to manage a debate like that. But there is a couple things that came to mind here, and there were some concerning things that were said by a few of them, but one in particular bothered me, and that was Aaron O'Toole, when he was talking about Indigenous leadership, how he was going to talk to them and talk to the Indigenous leadership in academia, in nonprofits, in business, but not the elected Indigenous leaders of who are accountable to the people who voted for them. That seemed like a huge gap in there for me. But other than that, yeah, there was a lot to take in, a lot for them to cover, and I thought it was a little bit of a mess there, a little bit of a gong show.
Well, we'll talk more about that mess a little later here in the show. We'll also talk more about Melissa. We'll talk with Melissa. She'll be joining us from Gatineau with some of her thoughts. Proud moment here for myself as well and the AP10 family. And I don't think we would have heard about child welfare or, Indian Act bureaucracy, these types of things if Melissa wasn't there. Well, you might also notice that Daryl Stranger has joined us here on the desk. Daryl, you were watching along. What we're looking for some of the highlights. What stood out for you?
Yeah, Dennis, well, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth, but a highlight, like you said, for us here at APTN, was a journalist in these debates. Our very own Melissa Ridgen hosted the open debate on reconciliation, starting with a question about dismantling of the Indian Act. Here's a little bit of that.
I think if there's one thing that Canadians and Indigenous people can all agree upon, it is that this Indian Act system is not working for anybody. How would you dismantle this broken top-down system, and what would you replace it with that would ensure that Canada still is living up to its constitutional obligations to Indigenous people?
First of all, we are looking forward to dismantling the Indian Act. It is a commitment of ours, but it is not something that Ottawa gets to decide. And what replaces the Indian Act will vary from community to community as we live up to our obligations. And that's why over the years, as we've moved towards self-government, we have accompanied communities, some who want to start with health, some who want to start with education, some who want to start with economic development. Every community, every nation across this country gets to help define what its path is forward. We will be there to listen, to partner, to build a better future every step of the way.
The way to go forward is to listen to leaders. And Mr. Trudeau ignored one that he had in his own cabinet, in Jody Wilson-Raybould. That was a huge lost opportunity. We've been speaking to people with how we can accelerate treaty resolution. There are some treaty negotiations, Ms. Ridgen, that have been going on, as you probably know, for decades. We need to solve it, and we need to work with Indigenous leaders. There's incredible Indigenous leaders in nonprofits, in the private sector, in industry, in academia. We need to use that governance capacity to finalize treaties and build partnerships. Absolutely. Because the best way forward is success for Indigenous peoples alongside their neighbors, alongside
Mr. Singh and then Mr. Trudeau. I'm coming to you, Mr. Trudeau.
I'll just jump in on this one point. I think absolutely the solution has to be Indigenous-led. And I think that's the starting point. And for a long time, we've seen that there's been a top-down approach that has to change. It has to be Indigenous people at the table. But I want to talk about the impacts, so just we understand how severe this is, how the Indian Act is creating injustice and perpetuating injustice. I spoke to B, who's a young woman, a young girl who lives in Niskandiga, and she told me in her own voice, she said, I'm a 12-year-old girl and I'm fighting for clean drinking water. How does that make any sense? Those words haunt me to this day. I think about what 12-year-olds do, and they certainly aren't fighting for clean drinking water. That is a legacy. That is the impact of the Indian Act.
I really just want to try to recenter our conversation on Indigenous peoples and what we are going to do to fulfill the many unfulfilled promises and commitments that have been made. And I would say, perhaps to pick up on what has been said, that it seems all too often that reconciliation is treated like a buffet. You can opt in for this, pick this plate, but not the other one.
Jody, you're listening in there. What was your impression of the leaders' answers about dismantling the Indian Act?
Well, no one talked about investing in First Nations governance, in investing in First Nations leadership, and investing in First Nations legal tradition building. So, how are the ways that we are going to govern ourselves once the Indian Act is removed? What are the ways in which we are going to be in relation with the Canadian state? So that was missing. What I loved on social media was that, Jody Wilson-Raybould is winning, the race today, as well as the hashtag around, reconciliation as a buffet. So there's a lot to unpack in those statements, as well as what Bill had mentioned earlier around O'Toole's statement around our leadership. He didn't mention First Nations leaders, chiefs at all, and that's very problematic and incredibly worrisome.
Okay, we're going to talk much more about what the leaders had to say and didn't have to say. First, we're going to head back to Gatineau, though, where our Melissa Ridgen, I understand, is standing by. She, of course, was one of the journalists taking part in tonight's debate. Melissa, great to see you. You're not on Twitter anymore, unfortunately. You were trending there for a while, though, but it was for good reasons. For someone who was directly involved in tonight's debate, is there anything that sticks out for you?
Hey, good to see you guys. Yeah, I mean, how could you not say what stuck out tonight? APTN was there. Reconciliation was discussed, like a full block of it, right? It was interesting, people saying, oh, thank you, at the beginning of this debate, oh, thank you, we're so glad APTN could be here. It's like, this is the first time we've been around for 22 years, this is the first time you've even cared to make room at this table for us. So let's start with that. But an entire block on reconciliation. I mean, to me that says we, have an opportunity at APTN that we could set the tone for people to even understand some of the questions that they probably haven't asked themselves, don't even know about. So ask questions that kind of educate and inform a little bit, and then let's see where the answers go. And I think that happened.
Well, if I didn't say it already, you did a great job, and you did bring up issues that I just mentioned that we wouldn't have heard. I don't think there's been a leaders' debate that's really touched on child welfare or things like that. You've been deep into the planning process for weeks on this now. You're the first APTN journalist to ever take part, as you mentioned. What are your thoughts on finally including an Indigenous journalist?
I think that they figured out that there's room for this now. Now, would they have figured it out on their own without our dead children? Probably not. I think that's the uproar over that. Canadians saying, like, you know, we've got to reconcile, we've got to figure this out. And then, you know, the media is like, yeah, we should probably invite these guys to the table. And so, because there's an appetite for this sort of conversation, whichever way we got here, I guess, is irrelevant. We're here, and I don't think we can go anywhere after this. I think that this is just the beginning of us always being here.
Sure, you were maybe in a different headspace at the time when this was going on, but did you feel as though you got some of the answers you were looking for in those questions you were asking of the leaders?
I mean, as much as you can get answers in debates, right? Everybody talks to their talking points. I think with the win, what my takeaway for the win in all of this is that the seed was planted with Canadians today. Things that they should be paying attention to, knowing that the residential school legacy is not over; it continued. You've got as many kids in government custody now, more so than at the height of residential school. Start paying attention. Get to the Google. Start educating yourself. Maybe people should start flipping back through that TRC report. There's a whole bunch of gems in there that I think people weren't paying attention to. So I hope that by APTN being here, asking the questions that we asked, regardless of what the answers were, I think that the questions should be enough to get people thinking, and I hope to see that people get educated.
Well, Melissa, we'll let you go, but again, great work there tonight, and you did us all proud.
Thanks.
And great work from your producer, Beverly Andrews, as well. And
Beverly working here like a dog. Jason LaRue here working like a dog. It was great. Yeah, the whole crew, the debate crew was amazing. This production was, a lot goes into it. And whether you're in the mood for a federal election or not, be grateful that there are people who put something like this together, so you at least have something to go by before you go and mark your ballot on the 20th.
Awesome, Melissa. Thanks so much. Safe travels home for you and Bev. We're going to go back to Daryl in a minute, but I just want to get some reaction here first from Will. Anything that Melissa had to say there stick out for you?
Yeah, no, she's. It was really satisfying to see her, and like you said, to see the stuff on Twitter. And I know Jody talked about that too. Like the winners are none of the 5 of them that were up there. It was Jody, it was Melissa, it was Dennis. You know, like that was a pretty cool thing to see that's coming on Twitter here. And I think she's right though, that being able to ask those questions gives our issues that level of uptake into the Canadian consciousness that has never been there before. Because in this year of any years, that should have been the #1 issue right across the board. And all of a sudden, because of our attention spans are so short, you know, 144 characters, that we have to push our way in there. And I'm really glad APTN did that because you know, those issues have to be there. Canadians have to understand them, and they have to be able to take them into account when they are marking their ballots, like she said. So very, very proud of her.
Jody, to you, anything that Melissa had to say? I mean, the one thing that stuck out for me that Green Party leader Annamie Paul kept saying too was making room for us, making space. Any thoughts on what Melissa had to say?
You know, it was really insightful to see the response around the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women inquiry and the violence that women experience in this country, and that no one talked about how to hold perpetrators accountable. No one talked about the justice system or systemic racism and their response. So, you know, Melissa brought really important questions to the table that we need to start solving in our own nations, with our own laws, our own judiciary systems, with our own processes, but also how we do that in relation to the Canadian state. So it was fantastic seeing her up there, and she held her own. And in fact, I believe the journalists were far more eloquent and graceful and intelligent than what we saw from the candidates.
No comments there. Daryl, we'll head back over to you now. You've got some more highlights that caught your attention at the debate tonight.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that stood out was climate change, as your guests had mentioned in the pre-debate show. It's a huge issue this time around for voters. Moderator Shachi Kurl asked the leaders how they will create effective climate change policy when so many people still don't believe it exists. Here's a little bit of that.
How can we achieve real progress when so many people are still debating the fundamentals? Mr. O'Toole, you begin.
Climate change is a real threat, not only to Canada and to the world. That's why we have to take a serious plan to tackle it. That's why, as I said, we put our plan out in April, because we had to restore some trust on this issue to make sure we can show Canadians we can get emissions down and get the economy working again. That is key. We have a plan to meet our Paris targets, but minimize the impact on jobs and investment. We're also going to make major investments in electric vehicles, in the hydrogen economy, small modular reactors. There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change. And you ask about how we're going to convince the quarter of Canadians who still don't think climate change is real. Well, Mr. O'Toole can't even convince his party that climate change is real, because they voted against that.
Well, here's the thing. We just heard Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau argue about who's worse. And honestly, it's a tough question to answer. Let me tell you, you're not stuck with these two. Better is possible. We can invest in a clean economy. We can end fossil fuel subsidies. We can make sure we're creating clean transportation, and we can invest in provinces and territories to make sure they have the resources necessary to fight the climate crisis. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm going to be a dad soon, and I want to make sure my child grows up into a future that has the same opportunities that I had, that has clean air, clean water, a clean place to live. I want to make sure that that's
as far as I understand it, it is not a national or even less a regional issue. It is a planetary issue, and it has to be tackled by everybody at once. But I would be glad to give some of my precious time to Mr. O'Toole, because a week ago, a little more than that, he said in French that he did not want anymore to have a pipeline to go through Quebec. That was quite a statement. He said that in French, no more pipeline through Quebec. I want to hear that in English tonight.
No,
please, please.
Well, Mr.
Hold on. This segment is...
I'll take time.
Quite frankly, this...
We're not going to let that happen.
This on the climate, this sort of approach is going to get us nowhere, and I mean but nowhere. It is, and the question was an excellent one. This is a global issue. This is a national issue. This is a nonpartisan issue, and we have got to be able to come together across party lines. I said that I was available for a debate just on the climate because it's that important, but we've invited many times all of the parties to join us in a joint cabinet, a cross-party cabinet, to deal with this the way that we dealt with the pandemic, together. People were so inspired to see these leaders come together in the early days of the pandemic. We have got to bring that same approach here. Let's come together.
Will, your thoughts? I mean, we had a whole segment in this debate about climate change here. Thoughts on that?
No, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, because there was one thing that stuck out with me on climate change. We got 4 leaders who are trying to raise the bar and do more. You got one leader who wants to, he literally said, Aaron O'Toole literally said he's going to lower the targets so that he can meet them. Like he was very upset that Trudeau didn't meet the targets, but his solution wasn't to do more. His solution was to make the targets less. And so what's he going to do if he doesn't make them? He's going to keep reducing the targets until there's no targets, and then he's met his target. That was a really strange one for me that came out of there.
Jody, over to you. Any thoughts on what you heard or didn't hear in the climate change portion of the debate?
Yeah, you know, it's we're in an existential crisis around the world. Scientists have been talking about pandemic-like viruses for well over a decade, and we weren't prepared. Scientists have also been talking about the fires that are coming, the floodings, and we still are, 1 in 4 people believe that climate change is real. This speaks volumes about the leadership that we've had in Canada for well over the past decade. Indigenous people on the land, because we're on the land, we see what's happening in our rivers and to the, when we're checking our traps and our snares, the difference in the biodiversity. So we're very aware of what's happening on the land. And when we see the leaders of this country talk about, we're not meeting the mark, we're going to reduce, the goals, it's terrifying. We actually need to change the status quo in this country in the way that we're going to do things. And I really want to applaud Anna May's approach about working collaboratively, that we need to, all parties need to set aside their ideologies and really put climate change on the forefront so that we can protect all the citizens in this country, so that we have air to breathe, that the animals can thrive on the land as they have previously. Everyone is suffering, and we must do things different. Climate change has to be on the forefront in all of the parties.
When we saw that climate was going to be one of the main topics, the main themes here, I thought, okay, there'll be a lot of discussion here about Indigenous peoples in that. But one of the only times I heard it brought up was from Mr. O'Toole when he was talking about, partnering with Indigenous people in energy resource projects. Jody, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I found that a little bizarre. And what I was hoping he would talk to around those sort of developments would be about how we might do more geothermal, how we might do more solar panel and wind, and so that we can do things differently. But in fact, he's reliant on non-renewable resource extraction, and that's getting old, and we need to do things differently. If we look around the world, people are doing things differently, and they're having great success with it. So Canada can adapt those models, and we can do those things. And Indigenous nations are doing those things. There are many of our First Nations across the country that are doing solar panel, that are doing geothermal. So it wasn't clear what he was stating in that relationship, but we need to move beyond what oil and gas has done, because it's not going to feed the future.
Will, hopefully we'll get a chance to get your take on that, because the MMF did have some partnerships. I mean, a lot of people, Indigenous people, work in the oil and gas industry and other resource-based industries, but we must go to check in now with our social media editor, Savannah Kelly, to take a look at what people were saying during the debate. And Savannah, I'll just apologize because we missed you in the pre-show. We meant to get there and ran out of time, so making space for you here this time. What were you seeing there on social media?
Thank you so much, Dennis, and no worries at all. So we asked our online viewers how they thought that the federal leaders fared in tonight's debate, and just to kind of get a sense of what issues our viewers think are the most important in this upcoming election. So here are a few of their comments. Melissa on Facebook says, reconciliation is one topic being covered tonight. My question is, what are the prospective prime ministers going to do about the mass graves being found across the country? Will they prosecute those who are responsible for these institutions? Quorum wants to know, what about intergenerational trauma? Indigenous children get a new school and trauma disappears? Brandon believes clean drinking water is the #1 issue, saying that water should have been the first priority. But Sharon's top priority for this election is housing, saying that the government needs to take full control of housing. Rent is out of control, highway robbery. So many families are struggling. Our viewer Levi was not impressed with tonight's debate answers, saying, I would not even trust these people to lead a hot dog stand, let alone a country. APTN's very own Melissa Ridgen also received a lot of love on Twitter and compliments for the questions that she asked federal leaders. So let's take a look at some of those. Lawrence on Twitter said, Melissa Ridgen from APTN News came through with the critical questions and tenacity everyone deserves to see during the leaders' debate. RJ said, I couldn't be more proud of Melissa Ridgen with how she conducted herself with the leaders and the questions she asked. A true check on power I hope leads to genuine change. And lastly, Chris said, slow clap to Melissa Ridgen, APTN News, on igniting debate on dismantling the Indian Act. And these are just a few of the comments that we received online. Great job, Melissa. If you guys want to keep the conversation going, comment on our Facebook page or send a tweet at us and follow along with our election coverage coming up soon as well. Back to you in the studio.
Savannah, thanks so much for that. Great to hear what people out there had to say during this debate. And, you know, some of those things that they brought up weren't even discussed all that much, if at all. Jody, your thoughts on some of the issues that, you know, people are talking about on social media that didn't really get discussed all that much at the debate here tonight?
Well, they actually didn't discuss anything thoroughly. They didn't give any sort of plan, depth, strategy. I mean, there was overarching generalizations around housing, but there was no clear plan. And so that leaves people unsettled. Like, how do you make a decision? Which party is going to lead the Canadian state in the best way possible? And how do we as Indigenous people have the best relationship with that leadership? So there was lots of unsettling moments. And I love what National Chief Roseanne Archibald tweeted around, let's have a full-on Indigenous First Nations debate so we can flesh out these issues.
Which was something the AFN did talk about. Maybe they should have been a little louder or out earlier with it. I think what we were seeing on Twitter, we might know who might host that thing. Will, anybody that, or any of the issues that you didn't hear tonight that you would have liked to?
Yeah, no, you know, I think Jody hits the nail on the head, and it's hard. You know, I couldn't imagine managing that, but I also couldn't imagine being one of the folks who has to sit there and debate, because you've got those 45 seconds. And that's extremely difficult to explain an entire plan. And that's why, you know, like our Métis government here in Manitoba, we put together, we went and surveyed our people, what are your priorities? Then we went and asked questions of all the parties. We got responses from most of them. And we want people to come and take a look at the priorities that the Métis Nation has. And if you want to help the Métis Nation move forward and progress, then you should take a look at the platforms, because that will give you a much better indication than this. That, to me, that was a very dysfunctional display. And I'm sure they all did their best, including the moderators, but it was really difficult to watch it sometimes and hard to understand what they were saying.
Will, do you think anybody's minds were changed here after what you just said? Probably not, but do you think anybody's minds were swayed here tonight?
Yeah, you know, there's a couple of issues I wanted to touch on, and you know, I was so, again, I want to underline, happy to see APTN there, an Indigenous reporter, but it was fairly bland as far as I was concerned. There wasn't, the Métis Nation wasn't mentioned once. There was, as I said before, Aaron O'Toole wants to talk to everybody except elected Indigenous leadership. You know, there's quite a few things that I think that could have been in there, should have been in there, but you know, if we want to continue moving forward, I think we need to look at the platforms. We need to look, and you know, one of the things that Singh said is that there have been no progress on Indigenous issues, and honestly, as the Minister of Housing for the Manitoba Métis Federation, I can say there's been huge progress. We're doing things now that we haven't been able to do for decades, and although more could be done, absolutely, on lots of different issues. But for us, there is, you know, we are making progress, and I would hate to see us take a step backward by having a party that goes back where Indigenous people are not the priority.
Jody, we've got 1 minute left, and that last minute's yours. Do you think anybody's minds were changed here? Any parting thoughts here on the final night of the final
You
debate?
know, I think it's going to be difficult for Canadians to decide who to vote for. There wasn't anyone who inspired me to think that Canada is going to do better and that we are going to change the status quo and that we're going to have good relations with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in this country. It was thoroughly disappointing, and I want to wish voters the best of luck.
Thanks for that, Jody. Hit the nail on the head again. That is unfortunately all the time we have for our Election 2021 APTN National News Debate Night Special. Our thanks to Daryl as well. The good news is we will have another special here on election night from 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Time. That's Monday, September 20th. Melissa will be back here in studio with us. Will and Jody will be here with us again. We'll also be joined by Michael Champagne, Pam Palmater, and National Chief Roseanne Archibald. So a great thanks to our crew here tonight as well. We'll see you back here for election night.